He straightens his tie and jokes about my paycheck while the glass door seals behind me. The latch makes a clean sound precise as a metronome, and the hallway light thins into a narrow blade that stops at the threshold, leaving us in a paneled quiet that belongs to him. I stand where he guided me, palm hovering near the handle, feeling the cool through my skin, as if the glass knows my temperature better than he does. His reflection floats over mine crisp shoulders, over my softer outline, two versions of marriage stacked in one surface, and he keeps smiling the way he does when the decision has already been signed. The office smells like paper and lemon polish, a practiced cleanliness, and the city hum presses its face to the window without getting in. He calls the joke, harmless calls me sensitive, when my mouth doesn't move, and taps the knot of his tie as if centering a point on a chart only he can see. The glass door stays closed. It doesn't argue. I watch the way authority arranges the room chair angled toward his desk, my feet square to the exit that won't open, and I feel the carefulness arrive, that steady calm that keeps my voice from betraying me. He speaks about alignment and family in the same breath, his tone warm enough to burn, and I notice how the word family shrinks when it passes through corporate air. I don't correct him, not now, because correction is a gift, and I'm done handing those out for free. My reflection holds its face. My breath doesn't fog the glass. The door handle refuses to turn, not because it's locked, but because he has decided it will not move yet, and the difference matters. He tells me the market is unforgiving, that sacrifice builds character, and his eyes flick to the door as if the building itself is listening for agreement. The city's light slices the floor into grids, pale squares, that make the room look measured, solvable, and I step into one without being told, the way I learned to do long before this marriage, long before the title on his door started to outrank the ring on my hand. The silence stretches thin and elastic, and I let it, because silence has always been my cheapest leverage. He says my name softly, then my role then, the figure again rounding it like a joke meant to land on a friendly table, and I see how easily a private voice can be sharpened into a public blade. My hand smooths the edge of a folder. I don't need a habit that keeps my fingers from shaking, and the glass takes the motion and sends it back to me doubled. The office clock ticks in a rhythm that belongs to policies and minutes billed, and my pulse learns it quickly syncing the way it does when pressure wants obedience. He leans back satisfied with the shape of the moment, and the chair sighs in approval. I think about the way doors are made, how they promise passage while practicing refusal, and how people learn from architecture. In the glass, my wife's face and my employee's face overlap, and neither one blinks. He says we'll talk later, as if later isn't already standing here, as if the present hasn't made its claim with a sealed door and a smile. I nod once controlled, because nods are currency in rooms like this, and because refusing would cost more than I'm willing to pay today. The light shifts as a cloud crosses the sun, and for a second, his reflection fractures not enough to notice unless you're watching for it, which I am. He rises, the meeting ending without minutes, and gestures toward the door with the same hand that signs approvals, a choreography, so practiced it feels generous. The latch clicks again, permission restored, and the hallway sound pours back like air into a vacuum, carrying footsteps and the ordinary mercy of other people passing by. I step through without brushing him, the glass cool against my shoulder, as if it wants to remember me, and I don't look back because looking back would grant him another frame. The corridor stretches clean and bright, and my reflection fades into other reflections diluted by distance. But the image stays with me, precise and portable. I walk away at the pace expected of gratitude, my posture obedient, my mind inventorying surfaces, exits angles, the way it always does when a room declares itself hostile. The door seals behind me again, this time on its own, and I feel the decision settle, where resolve lives quiet and exact, ready to be used. The glass keeps my face as I leave, already rehearsing who owns it next. I'm Emily Carter, 36, a senior financial analyst from Boston, Massachusetts. In the weeks before that meeting, life had arranged itself into clean routines that made everything feel reasonable, even kind, the way a well-lit office can convince you it has nothing to hide. I arrived early, left late, kept my head down, and learned the temperature of rooms by the sound of my shoes on the floor. At home, I learned the same thing by the pitch of his voice when he asked about my day. The mirror in our bathroom became my quiet checkpoint each morning, a rectangle of polished truth where I practiced neutrality before the workday began. I adjusted my collar, smoothed my hair, and watched my face settle into the version that passed without comment, the one that belonged to both wife and employee, without asking either role to explain itself. My reflection stayed calm, while his voice bent the room. The sentence lodged itself in me without ceremony, a description more than a warning, and I didn't question it because nothing had yet demanded a question. He kissed my cheek with the same efficiency he used to close emails warm but brief, and reminded me to drive safely, as if the road were the only place risk lived. At the office, glass walls divided departments into visible privacy, and I learned to read their angles, like weather, noting where reflections overlapped and where they cut clean. He praised me in meetings with a practiced generosity, the kind that felt earned because it arrived on schedule, and in the hallway, he corrected my phrasing with a smile that suggested improvement was a favor. I kept a running list of adjustments in my head, small calibrations that made the system hum, and told myself this was partnership, that efficiency could look like affection when you stood close enough to it. My access changed subtly, not enough to raise alarms, just a permissions shift framed as streamlining, and I accepted it because acceptance had always been cheaper than resistance. At night, the mirror caught me again, loosening my face as the day fell away, and I noticed how easily the calm returned when the light softened and the room belonged to us. He talked about targets and markets over dinner, and I listened the way I always had, tracking implications, filing away tone, measuring pauses, telling myself that knowledge was a form of safety. The mirror reflected our kitchen in pieces, countertop, window, my shoulder. And I liked that I could choose which piece to study, that I could look without being seen looking. There were moments when the air tightened, when a comment landed heavier than it should have, but I let them pass because storms pass when you don't invite them inside. I focused on precision, on keeping my work immaculate, on being the person who fixed small errors before they grew teeth. The mirror showed me split by light, and I learned which side survived silence. That realization didn't arrive with drama. It settled like a habit, and habits are powerful because they don't announce themselves. He asked me once why I stayed so late, and I said it made tomorrow easier, which was true in the narrow way truths often are. I stayed because staying let me watch patterns form, let me see how decisions rippled before they were named, let me understand where a smile ended and an order began. At home, he apologized for stress with a tenderness that felt sincere, and I accepted it because sincerity isn't proof of innocence. It's just another tone. The mirror took in my acceptance without comment, gave it back to me intact, and I appreciated its restraint. I noticed how often I adjusted paper edges when I was thinking a small habit that kept my hands busy, and how that habit intensified when conversations blurred into directives. Nothing happened that could be pointed to, no single moment that demanded intervention, and that was the point. The absence of spectacle is how systems teach patience. When colleagues spoke about balance, I nodded, understanding that balance is a word used by people standing on solid ground. The days stacked neatly indistinguishable until you held them up to the light, and I didn't hold them up yet because I was learning the weight first. He began using we in context that narrowed my space, and I pretended not to hear the possessive edge because pretending has its own momentum. In the mirror, my eyes stayed steady, my mouth neutral, my shoulders squared, and I trusted that steadiness, the way you trust a handrail before you need it. I told myself that marriage was a long negotiation, that work was a language with its own grammar, and that fluency required listening more than speaking. The mirror agreed by saying nothing, which felt like permission. I went to sleep believing that calm was a skill, that it could be practiced until it paid dividends, and that silence properly managed could buy time. I kept my face neutral because neutrality teaches rooms how far they can go. The first fracture arrived disguised as routine, the kind that slips through because it wears the right badge. I was reviewing expense allocations in a quiet corner of the floor the early hour, giving the glass walls a milky sheen when a receipt slid free from a stack and caught on my thumb. Its corner was curled and soft from handling the paper edge, smoothed the way documents get when they've been passed with confidence. I flattened it against the desk and let my eyes do what they're trained to do, moving from category to category, noting nothing until something insisted on being noted. The figure was small enough to hide in the margins of a quarterly report, but it sat where it didn't belong, a clean number wearing the wrong coat. I checked the reference line, Ref KX41, and the allocation tag, then traced the trail backward to the department code that had learned my husband's handwriting by heart. The office hummed around me. Printers warming screens, waking colleagues arriving with the soft percussion of coffee cups. And I kept my posture neutral because neutrality keeps people from asking questions they're not ready to answer. The receipt corner pressed into my skin as if to insist on its presence, and I felt the reflex to correct it, rise and fall a habit from years of being the one who cleans the room before guests arrive. Instead, I let the habit pass. I opened the ledger again and matched the line item to the tier it claimed to occupy, then to the tier it should have occupied, and the mismatch showed itself without drama, a polite error that benefited exactly one corridor. The number wasn't large, not yet, but its direction was clear-angled toward authority, the way filings always seem to be when gravity is involved. I glanced at the glass and saw my reflection split by a seam of light, one eye in shadow, one catching the glow of the monitor, and the image steadied me more than it should have. My reflection stayed calm while his voice bent the room. The thought returned without asking, not as memory, but as instruction. I checked the approval chain, noting initials that passed like a relay baton, each hand trusting the last, and I understood how a system learns to look away when the gesture is familiar. The receipt's amount didn't match the compensation tier it implied, not by policy, not by precedent, and the explanation that presented itself was the one that costs nothing to accept clerical drift. I could have flagged it, routed a note, earned a nod for diligence. Instead, I slipped the receipt into a thin folder and labeled it with a date range written in pencil, light enough to erase, dark enough to read. The office smelled faintly of toner and citrus cleaner, and the sound of his door opening down the hall traveled toward me with the confidence of ownership. He passed my desk without stopping, offered a smile that fit the morning, and I returned it with interest, both of us fluent in the exchange. He asked how the numbers looked, and I said stable, which was true if you believe stability means not tipping over while the ground moves beneath you. As he walked on, I felt the weight of the small decisions settle, not heavy, just present, and I recognized it as the first time I had chosen to watch rather than fix. The receipt corner dug into my thumb, and the number it hid pointed only one way. I ran the comparison again, slower, letting the logic breathe, and the same answer arrived without argument. The discrepancy wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It lived in the space between what's said and what's signed, a narrow corridor where trust does the walking. A colleague stopped by to ask about a variance elsewhere, and I answered easily, my voice doing its job while my mind mapped routes I hadn't needed before. When she left, I closed the folder and aligned it with the others, the paper edges neat, the pencil mark faint, and I felt the shift take hold. Not anger, not fear, but orientation. The receipt had taught me where to stand. At home that night, he talked about the week ahead, about targets and timing, and I listened the way I always had, attentive, agreeable, storing cadence and emphasis like data points. The image of the curled paper returned when he laughed at something trivial, and I noticed how laughter-like numbers can be used to round away detail. I went to bed with the calm intact, my face smooth in the dark, and I understood that the system prefers silence, not because silence is empty, but because it's spacious. I had found a place to set something down without being seen. I kept the receipt, and the room learned to keep secrets back. The office floor was already awake when I stepped out of the elevator, a low tide of voices moving between glass partitions, the day's confidence arranged into corridors and corners. My conference badge tapped softly against my sternum as I walked the lanyard catching on my jacket, just enough to be annoying a reminder that visibility comes with friction. The glass walls turned people into reflections before they became faces, and I read posture and pace the way others read headlines. He had called a brief alignment meeting informal, he said, which meant public enough to matter and small enough to control. We gathered near the open conference space, sunlight slicing the carpet into pale grids, and I took a place at the edge where exits stay visible. The junior analyst stood across from me, eyes flicking between screens and people hands too still for comfort, and I recognized the look of someone learning where not to look. He began with praise, his voice warm, the kind that fills rooms without raising its volume, and I felt the cadence settle the group into expectation. Then he shifted casually to resource optimization, to adjustments that would streamline delivery. And he glanced at me with a familiarity that drew a few smiles from the circle. My badge swung once as I breathed the plastic edge cool against my fingers when I steadied it, and I watched the way authority arranges agreement before it asks for it. He referenced an internal memo. "A simple thing already circulated," he said, and nodded toward the screen where a header blinked into focus. The document looked ordinary white space and bullet points, but the details mattered, and they were wrong in a way that only matters when you're standing in front of witnesses. I stepped closer enough to read the footer without touching the keyboard, and there it was. Dept. ID C17 issue time 0842. A neat stamp that contradicted the timeline he'd given me in private. The junior analyst's eyes darted to the same line, then back to me, a microsecond of recognition that landed heavier than any question. He continued speaking, framing the change as collaborative as necessary, and I felt the room's attention tilt not toward the content, but toward the choreography. The memo's issue time sat there quiet and exact, refusing to align with the story being told, and the glass walls reflected our small circle back at itself, a loop of faces learning in real time. I asked one clarifying question, neutral in tone, precise in language, and he answered with a smile that did not reach the document. The answer slid around the timestamp without touching it, and a few heads nodded anyway because nodding is easier than reading. The memo glowed on the screen, stamped in public, while his explanation arrived late. The junior analyst shifted, badge flashing as he moved, and I saw the decision form behind his eyes. Remember this. The meeting wrapped quickly after that, efficiency restored, and people dispersed with the relief of being spared a choice. He touched my elbow as if to reassure me, a private gesture performed in public, and murmured that we'd talk later, the phrase carrying its usual promise of containment. I nodded once, controlled my badge swinging again as I stepped away, and I felt the room mark the exchange the way rooms do quietly, permanently. At my desk, the glass partition reflected the open floor fragments of movement stitched together by light, and I replayed the memo's footer in my mind, the dept, ID the issue time, the way truth doesn't raise its voice. An email pinged somewhere behind me. Laughter traveled down the corridor, and the ordinary life of the office continued, but the texture had changed the way it does when a witness has been made. The junior analyst passed by later with a stack of printouts, slowed just enough to meet my eyes, then kept going, his pace careful, deliberate. I adjusted the edge of my badge until it lay flat, the habit grounding me, and I understood that the humiliation hadn't been loud, hadn't needed to be. It lived in the alignment between document and denial in the public space where both could be seen. When I left that evening, the glass doors reflected the floor back at me, a grid of light and shadow holding its breath, and I carried the image of the memo's footer the way you carry a map you didn't know you needed until you were already lost. The badge cooled against my palm as the floor learned which story would not line up. The break didn't announce itself. It compressed the way pressure does when it finds a seam. That night, after the house settled into its practiced quiet, I unfolded the payslip at the kitchen table and smoothed it flat with the side of my hand. The paper was creased from being folded too carefully, the kind of crease that comes from deciding where something belongs before admitting it exists. The overhead light cast a narrow band across the countertop, leaving the edges of the room in soft shadow, and I kept my shoulders squared posture neutral, as if the room were a witness that preferred composure. I read the line items slowly, not because I didn't understand them, but because understanding is cleaner when it's earned twice. Pay grade one level lower than my title allowed. Cycle marker and adjustment code that belonged to a different payroll rhythm than mine. The fields didn't argue, they simply declined to align. I compared the slip to last month's, then to the quarter before that, and the pattern emerged without flair, a gentle drift downward framed as administrative gravity. The refrigerator hummed behind me, a steady domestic bass line, and I thought about how easily numbers can be trained to whisper when they're told not to sing. I didn't feel anger yet. Anger requires noise. What I felt was the narrowing of options, the way a corridor looks longer when doors start closing behind you. I traced the pay grade notation with my finger, then the cycle code, and imagined the meeting where this had been justified, the language used to make it sound temporary, corrective, necessary. At work, I had learned that necessity is a story you tell after you've already chosen. I folded the payslip again, then unfolded it, testing how the paper remembered me, and set it beside the thin folder where the receipt lived, the two artifacts not touching but clearly acquainted. My phone buzzed with a message from him about dinner tomorrow, a soft domestic punctuation, and I placed the phone face down without reading it, not out of spite, but to preserve the quiet long enough to think. The kitchen window reflected my outline back at me, doubled faintly by the darkness outside, and I noticed how the reflection made room for more than one truth without insisting they reconcile. I went through the payroll portal on my tablet, careful to move like someone who belongs there, and pulled the cycle history for my role, noting the mismatch again the way the adjustment landed, just early enough to seed a narrative about performance later. The portal showed identifiers instead of names, tidy strings that made responsibility feel optional, and I copied the relevant fields into a private note, keeping my language spare, factual, unadorned. If this were a puzzle, the edges were forming. He came into the kitchen, then loosened tie slung over his shoulder, the same ease he carried into conference rooms, and asked if I'd eaten. I said not yet, which was true if you measure eating as nourishment rather than compliance. He glanced at the paper, asked what I was working on, and I told him I was organizing receipts, which was also true in the way truths like to travel together. He kissed my temple, apologized for the late night, and talked about budget pressure as if it were weather unavoidable and shared, and I nodded because nodding keeps conversation short. When he left the room, the light shifted as the refrigerator door closed and the payslip lay there with its neat typography, a polite document that had just redrawn my map. I thought about how systems prepare their exits quietly, how they introduce small discomforts first to see who will move on their own. I stacked the papers, aligned the edges, and slid them into the folder, the motion calming me the way organization always had. The payslip lay folded like a verdict, written small enough to pass as mercy. I washed my hands, the water warm grounding, and felt the weight of the choice settle where patience lives. This wasn't confrontation. It was orientation. At work the next day, I answered questions, fixed errors, met deadlines. The familiar choreography intact, and no one remarked on the shift because shifts like this are designed to be unremarkable. I noticed how often the language of improvement appeared in emails addressed to me, how often timelines shortened without explanation, how often my calendar filled with meetings that required listening more than speaking. Each detail added a grain to the scale, and the scale began to tip without tipping over. In the evening, I returned to the kitchen, reopened the folder, and wrote a single line beneath the copied field's pay grade variance. Cycle mismatch. No accusation, no conclusion. Facts age better than feelings. I closed the folder and placed it where I could reach it without looking, a practiced motion that kept my face calm and my mind awake. The break had arrived quiet and complete, and I understood that what had been taken wasn't just money. It was time leverage narrative. The room held its breath as if waiting to see what I would do with that understanding. I folded the slip away, and the house learned how quietly exits are built. By the time the pressure reached my phone, it had learned my habits. I was alone in the living room, lights low, the city reflected faintly in the window, when the screen glowed awake with a forwarded message that didn't belong to me. The glow painted my hands pale, turned fingerprints into maps, and I felt the familiar calm slide into place as I opened the thread without haste. The email looked ordinary, subject-trimmed, body polite, but the metadata hummed beneath it like a generator you only hear when the power is about to fail. I toggled the details view and let my eyes settle into their work, moving past names to the fields that never lie unless they're told to. Send time. 2117. IP region. Not ours, not even close. Forwarded time, earlier than the draft time by minutes that refused to explain themselves. The contradiction sat there clean and patient, a math problem with no interest in persuasion. I rested the phone against my knee and watched the glow steady, watched my reflection skim the glass of the screen and split at the edge where light met shadow. The screen reflected me twice as the timestamp broke. The line felt less like a thought than a diagnosis, and I accepted it with the relief that comes when uncertainty gives way to structure. I checked the header again, slower, noting the routing path, the way the message had been taught to look domestic while traveling like a stranger. At work the next morning, his tone carried the same warmth it always did, and I answered emails the way I always had my voice intact, my posture neutral, because nothing makes people careless like consistency. The phone stayed face down on my desk, its black surface absorbing the day, and I let meetings pass without contributing anything that could be used to decorate a story later. The email metadata replayed itself in my head, not as accusation, but as a sequence drafted here, sent there, forwarded back time, bent just enough to pass if no one checked. Systems rely on no one checking. I waited until late afternoon when the floor thinned and glass walls returned to mirrors and reopened the thread this time, cross-referencing server logs accessible to my role. Nothing special, nothing unauthorized, just the ordinary windows that open when you've earned them. The same mismatch appeared a polite refusal to align, and I saved a screenshot with the crop tight enough to exclude commentary, wide enough to show fields and numbers breathing together. My phone vibrated once with a message from him, asking about dinner, a domestic punctuation mark I chose not to read yet. In the corridor, the hum of ventilation flattened sound into a single note, and I felt the building exhale around me, the way it does when it believes in its own neutrality. Back home, the glow returned familiar now, and I copied the relevant fields into my private note, adding nothing but the facts, send time, forward time, IP region. No dates, no emotion. Facts age better than outrage. He arrived later than usual, loosened tie, practiced apology, and I listened the way I always had, attentive without engagement, my eyes returning to the phone only when he turned away. He talked about a vendor delay, about timing pressure, and the word timing caught for half a second before continuing a hitch small enough to miss unless you're watching for it. The timestamps argued with each other, and the phone refused to pick a side. I asked one neutral question about process, the kind that sounds supportive, and he answered with a sentence that skimmed the surface without touching the numbers. I nodded because nodding is a bridge that lets people cross without checking what's underneath. Later, when the house settled again, I ran the comparison once more this time, layering the metadata over the access patterns I'd been mapping since the receipt taught me where to stand. The roots matched. The bending of time wasn't random. It was taught. I set the phone on the table and watched the glow fade as the screen slept the room returning to its shapes, and I felt the pressure spike not as fear, but as momentum. This was the middle, the place where stories either scatter or cohere, and I chose coherence. At work the next day, I let a meeting end without correction, let a small misstatement stand, because it didn't matter yet, because timing matters more than truth, when truth is being prepared. The junior analyst passed my desk with a glance that asked a question he didn't want answered out loud, and I gave him nothing but calm, the kind that keeps people breathing. The phone stayed close, its presence a quiet weight, and I understood how leverage feels before it's named, not heavy, just precise. In the glass of my monitor, my face appeared twice, one image crisp, one slightly delayed, and I didn't try to merge them. I saved the screenshot to the folder, aligned the edges of the paper notes beneath it, and closed everything without ceremony. The system had taught me its tell, and it had done so by mistake, trusting time to behave. I locked the screen, knowing time had already slipped and would slip again. The building keeps its secrets in plain sight, which is how it convinces itself it's honest. I learned that on a Thursday afternoon when the corridor outside security hummed like a held note and the CCTV monitor frames glowed with the calm authority of observation. I wasn't there to watch anyone. I was there because my role required a routine check on access workflows tied to month-end controls, a legitimate reason that opened doors without asking why. The monitor nearest me displayed a tiled grid of feeds, each labeled with a small identifier that flattened drama into data. Camera ID A3 flickered once as the feed stabilized time code ticking in the corner with the confidence of something that believes in itself. I stood close enough to see the edges of the frame, the slight distortion where glass curves lie, and I waited for my breathing to match the room's rhythm before I looked for anything specific. The footage was unremarkable until it wasn't. An after-hours entry appeared where there shouldn't have been one, a clean swipe followed by a door opening that knew the hand it obeyed. The time code read 2203. The badge last four masked but consistent, and the movement was efficient, practiced, belonging to someone who never worries about being asked to explain. I watched the clip again slower, then cross-referenced it with the access window I'd already mapped, the one that learned to bend time when it needed to. The alignment snapped into place without noise. This wasn't an exception. It was a root. The monitor reflected my face back at me faintly, a ghost layered over the feed, and I recognized the look, not surprise, not fear, but calibration. At work, calibration is where power learns to hide. A security technician passed behind me, offered a neutral greeting, and kept walking, the unspoken agreement intact. Nothing here requires commentary. I noted the camera ID, the time code, the sequence of motion, and let the facts arrange themselves in my head without being pushed. Later, in the quiet of my office, I pulled the clip through the approved request channel, the one designed for audits that never make headlines, and the system complied the way systems do when you ask in their language. The frame froze on a hand near the reader, the door mid-swing, the corridor empty enough to swallow sound, and I felt the pressure rise, not as panic, but as clarity. This was witness without a witness observation that didn't need eyes because it had already been seen by the building. I saved the still with the crop tight, leaving the camera ID and time code breathing at the edges, and placed it in the folder with the others, the paper notes aligned beneath like a spine. The junior analyst crossed my path later with a look that asked permission to know less, and I gave it to him with a nod that closed the question without locking it. He didn't need to be here for what came next. Buildings remember well enough on their own. At home, the house moved around us, as if nothing had changed, his voice familiar. His stories polished, and I listened the way I always had, measuring cadence, noting where emphasis landed too cleanly. The glow of the monitor returned to me in memory, the time code ticking forward, no matter who wanted it to stop, and I understood how authority forgets itself when it believes no one is watching. The camera watched without blinking, and the corridor told the truth in numbers. I didn't confront him. Confrontation scatters facts. Instead, I prepared the ground, letting days pass, letting meetings end with smiles, letting the building keep doing what it does best. Recording. When I checked the feed again, a different night, a different route, the same efficiency appeared, and the pattern deepened into something undeniable. The system had given me a witness that couldn't be shamed or persuaded, and I respected it by keeping my voice level and my hands steady. I printed the still on standard paper, no color, no drama, and slid it into the folder behind the email fields, behind the payslip, behind the receipt that started this orientation. The order mattered. Evidence likes company when it's about to be believed. I closed the folder and placed it where my hand could find it without looking, the motion practiced invisible. Outside, the city's light pressed against the windows, indifferent to intent, and inside the house learned the shape of my quiet. The reversal wasn't here yet. It was assembling. I let the cameras keep watching because the building never forgets who walked alone. The contradiction didn't announce itself. It waited until the room believed it was finished talking. I found it late when the floor thinned and the glass returned to mirrors the day's noise settling into a hum that made thinking feel earned. The time-stamped email print lay on my desk, its margins clean, the header precise enough to inspire trust. I had printed it because paper slows, lies down, because ink refuses to refresh itself into obedience. I set the page beneath the monitor light and traced the fields with my eyes, letting the logic unfold without interruption. Draft time earlier than the forward. Forward time earlier than the send. The order broke itself quietly, a ladder missing a rung that everyone had been climbing anyway. I pulled the original thread, then the forwarded version, aligning them side by side until the mismatch could no longer pretend it was a rounding error. The printer ticked behind me, cooling, and the smell of warm paper made the office feel briefly domestic, as if truth prefers familiar rooms. I marked the fields with a pencil dot, nothing dramatic, just enough to remember where to look, and felt the shift inside me complete itself. This wasn't a mistake. It was choreography. The email had been taught to travel backward, to arrive before it left, to make approval look inevitable when it was anything but. I leaned back and watched the glass wall reflect the 2 pages into one blurred shape, then leaned forward again until the fields sharpened. The junior analyst passed by with a question that didn't matter, and I answered it easily, my voice steady, because steadiness invites confidence, where panic invites supervision. When he left, I slid the print into the folder behind the camera, still behind the metadata, behind the payslip, and felt the order click into place. The contradiction wanted witnesses, but not yet. It needed context to survive daylight. I opened my calendar and noticed how meetings had been stacked against me, how timelines narrowed with polite language, how the word alignment kept appearing like a chorus meant to drown out melody. The email print cooled under my palm, the paper firm and patient, and I understood that exposure without leverage would be mistaken for complaint. Leverage requires timing. I checked the header one last time, reading the fields aloud in my head, to strip them of tone, and the logic held. The email said it arrived before it was sent, and the system nodded along. I gathered my things and left, without correcting anyone, letting the misstatement stand in a meeting that wanted closure more than accuracy. Outside, the city's light felt harsher, unfiltered by glass, and I walked with the measured pace of someone who had chosen a direction. At home, he talked about pressure from above, about optics, about how important it was to look unified, and I listened without agreeing, my eyes drifting to the folder on the table, the way they always did now. He asked if something was wrong, a question shaped like concern, and I said I was tired, which was true in a way that didn't invite inspection. Later, alone again, I reopened the folder and reviewed the sequence as if I were a stranger to it, checking whether belief would arrive without persuasion. It did. The contradiction wasn't fragile, it was inevitable. This was the reversal point, the moment when watching becomes deciding, and deciding becomes preparation. I closed the folder and placed it back where my hand would find it, without thought, the muscle memory of intentions settling in. The glass reflected my face once, not twice, and the relief surprised me with its simplicity. The public scenes were finished for now. The next one would be different, deliberate, unavoidable. I filed the print away, knowing the timeline would not forgive itself. The decision cornered me on a morning that looked ordinary enough to pass without comment. I arrived early, the building still cool from night air, and slid my keycard into its sleeve with the care of someone handling a document rather than plastic. The sleeve had gone soft at the edges. From use, the transparent window clouded just enough to hide scratches, and I liked that it kept things visible without promising clarity. I crossed the lobby with my usual pace, nodding at security, letting the rhythm of access settle my breath, because calm makes rooms forget to watch you. At my desk, the monitor woke to a calendar stacked with meetings that required listening more than speaking a familiar choreography that narrowed my hours without saying why. I opened the access portal designed for compliance checks and pulled the log I had avoided, until now the one that would stop this from being observation and turn it into consequence. The fields loaded cleanly, badge last 4, masked entry time, precise to the minute door ID, specific enough to remove doubt. I scrolled steady, letting the pattern reveal itself without being led. Late entries where none should exist. Early exits timed to avoid overlap. A repetition that felt like muscle memory. I filtered by door and saw the route draw itself a clean line through spaces that pretended neutrality. The log didn't accuse, it recorded. It didn't explain, it insisted. I cross-checked the entries against the windows I'd mapped against the nights the email bent time and the camera watched alone, and the alignment clicked into place with a soundless certainty. This was the corner evidence that doesn't need a voice, but will demand one if you hesitate. I printed the page, cropping tight enough to keep the fields breathing wide enough to show the door ID and the entry times without commentary, and slid it into the sleeve with the others, the order deliberate. The junior analyst stopped by with a question about a variance that no longer mattered, and I answered easily, my voice intact, because intact voices buy you space. When he left, I closed the sleeve and felt the weight of it settle, not heavy, just exact. I walked the floor to a meeting where alignment was praised and timelines were praised louder, and I watched the way my husband's gaze skimmed past me when he spoke about accountability, the word chosen carefully enough to bruise without leaving marks. I didn't interrupt. Interruption is a gift when someone believes they deserve it. Instead, I noted the time he glanced at the door, the way his hand touched the table when authority wants anchoring, and I counted the seconds until the subject changed. The access log lined up with the doors he said he never touched. Afterward, I stepped into a glass corridor and let the building reflect my face back at me, one image crisp, one softened by distance, and I chose the crisp one because decisions prefer edges. I checked my phone and saw the message I'd avoided earlier, the domestic punctuation asking if we could talk tonight, and I left it unanswered, not to punish, but to preserve the shape of the day. At my desk, I reviewed the folder as if I were a stranger to it, letting doubt try its case and fail on facts. The receipt had taught me where to stand. The payslip had narrowed the corridor. The metadata had bent time. The camera had watched. Now the access log closed the loop with dates replaced by minutes and doors named without shame. This wasn't about catching him. It was about preventing escape. I scheduled one meeting for myself, brief labeled neutrally, and sent a calendar hold that didn't explain itself because explanations invite negotiation. The building hummed around me indifferent, and I appreciated its discipline. In the afternoon, an email arrived, reframing expectations with polite language and compressed timelines, the final nudge designed to make resignation look voluntary. I read it once and archived it without response because response would cost leverage. I placed the sleeve in my bag, felt the edge press against my palm, and understood how commitment feels before it's announced. Not dramatic, just complete. When I left that evening, the lobby lights reflected off the floor in pale bands, and my badge swung once before settling obedient to gravity. I didn't look back at his office door because looking back creates mirrors, and I was done splitting my face. At home, the house moved around us as if nothing had changed his voice. Familiar, his concern calibrated, and I listened without correcting the story he told himself about timing and trust. I slept lightly, waking once to the memory of the log's clean columns, and fell back with the relief that comes when the path stops branching. Morning arrived with the ordinary mercy of routine, and I dressed with the steadiness of someone who knows where she's going. The corner had done its work. The decision no longer needed me to carry it. I zipped the sleeve closed, knowing the next door would open in public. The room chose its silence before anyone spoke, which is how you know it understands consequence. The shareholder meeting convened in a glass-walled auditorium that pretended transparency while practicing control rows of chairs angled toward a screen that promised clarity on demand. I took my seat with the shareholder folder balanced on my lap, its weight modest, its contents exact. The folder's cover was plain, no branding, the kind of neutrality that lets facts arrive without costume. And I waited for the cadence to settle the greeting, the agenda, the confident reassurance that everything important had already been decided. He sat at the front, composed authority fitting him the way tailored suits always do, and when he spoke about alignment and forward momentum, heads nodded because nodding is easier when numbers are projected large enough to feel inevitable. I let the presentation move through its expected beats, my eyes tracking the slide transitions the way they always had, noting where emphasis softened and where it sharpened. When the chair invited questions, the pause stretched long enough to signal closure, and that was when I stood, not quickly, not slowly, just at the speed that makes rooms recalibrate. I introduced myself with the credentials that belonged to the folder, not the marriage, and placed it on the table where light could reach it without obstruction. The registry page lay on top, crisp the fields legible, holding percentage expressed cleanly proxy ID, printed without apology, the numbers aligned in a way that refused reinterpretation. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't explain the journey. I stated the fact of ownership as if it had always been part of the room's architecture, which in a way it was now. The murmur began as a ripple and settled into a hush that knows better than to argue with print. He looked at the page, then at me, then back at the page, and for the first time, I watched his smile fail to find a surface. The chair asked for clarification, and I provided it with one sentence that contained only identifiers and percentages, letting the proxy speak where narrative would only distract. The screen behind us still glowed with forecasts that no longer owned the future they described. The folder lay open, calm and undeniable, while the room learned who had been listening. Someone requested verification, and I nodded toward the counsel seated at the side, whose quiet confirmation carried the authority of rooms that don't rehearse. He reached for the folder and stopped himself, the instinct colliding with protocol, and the collision told the truth faster than any accusation. The glass walls reflected the scene back at itself, faces, paper posture multiplying the moment until denial ran out of places to stand. I answered 2 questions, both procedural, both brief, because procedure respects brevity when facts are complete. No one asked about motives. Motives are indulgent in rooms like this. The chair adjourned early, the decision made without ceremony, because ceremony would only slow what was already finished. As people rose, conversations formed and dissolved around us, the air shifting from confidence to calculation, and I gathered the folder without haste, returning it to my bag, as if it were a notebook rather than a key. He didn't speak. He watched the room learn a new center of gravity and understood too late that gravity doesn't negotiate. Outside the auditorium, the corridor filled with quiet congratulations and careful distance, the kind of acknowledgement that protects future relationships. I walked past him without contact, the glass doors parting on their own this time, and felt the absence of resistance register like relief. In the elevator, my reflection held steady, singular, the glass no longer splitting me into roles that argued with each other. The doors closed with a soft seal that belonged to me now, and the building descended without comment. In the lobby, light spilled across the floor in pale bands indifferent to hierarchy, and I crossed it with the same pace I always had, grateful for consistency. Outside, the city received me without fanfare, traffic flowing voices, rising the ordinary life of consequence, continuing as if it had been waiting. I checked my phone and saw the messages I'd left unanswered, the domestic punctuation finally punctured by reality, and I put the phone away because the public scene was complete. The truth had landed where it needed to, witnessed and recorded, and nothing more was required of it. I stepped into daylight knowing the glass had already changed hands. The payoff didn't arrive with noise, it arrived with paperwork, which is how consequences prefer to travel when they mean to last. The contract signature page waited on the table in counsel's office, the paper heavier than it looked, the margins generous enough to breathe. I took the chair offered to me and set my pen down beside the page without uncapping it, yet letting the room complete its small rituals. Doors closed softly. Phones silenced the hum of ventilation settling into a neutral key. Across from me, he sat where authority used to feel natural posture, controlled expression, measured the practiced calm of someone who believes in procedures even as they rearrange him. Counsel reviewed terms already understood, their voice steady, neutral, a bridge between facts and finality. I listened without interrupting tracking clauses, the way I always had, noting where language tightened and where it allowed daylight. The contract didn't accuse, it clarified. It translated leverage into structure, and structure into inevitability. When the pen finally met paper, the sound was modest, a soft drag that carried more weight than speeches ever do. I signed where indicated my name, fitting the line without flourish, and slid the page forward with the ease of habit. He hesitated before signing his own acknowledgement, a pause that registered not as defiance, but as recalibration, the moment when a system relearns gravity. Counsel waited. Rooms like this are patient. He signed. The page absorbed the ink without comment, indifferent to the history that led here. The glass of the office window reflected us both faintly, but the images didn't overlap anymore. They held their own space without arguing. I gathered the page and added it to the folder, the sequence complete. Now the order undeniable. Counsel outlined next steps, transitions, communications, timelines, and I nodded where appropriate, my attention already moving past execution to aftermath. There would be statements drafted with care, exits framed as opportunities, language that preserve dignity where possible, because dignity reduces litigation. I agreed to the terms that mattered and declined the ones that didn't, my voice level, my hands steady. The signature dried into permanence, while his authority learned its new address. We stood. He offered a wordless look that searched for something, leniency, recognition, a private appeal, and I returned a neutral acknowledgement, the kind that closes doors without slamming them. There was no confrontation to be had here. Confrontation belongs to earlier acts. This was administration. Outside the office, the corridor felt wider, the light less opinionated, and I walked it with the quiet satisfaction of alignment achieved on my terms. Messages arrived on my phone from stakeholders and colleagues, congratulatory, cautious, practical, and I responded to the ones that required response, letting the others sit until time cooled them. The junior analyst sent a brief note, nothing explicit, just thanks for clarity, and I replied with equal restraint, because restraint keeps people safe. At home that evening, the house received us with its familiar shapes, but the air had changed, no longer rehearsing the old lines. He moved through rooms as if measuring them for the first time, touching surfaces he had taken for granted, and I recognized the look of someone relearning scale. I cooked dinner without ceremony, the ordinary gestures grounding, and we ate without argument, conversation practical, bounded, already receding into something else. Later I reviewed the contract once more, not to second-guess but to let finality settle where resolve had lived. The glass of the window reflected a single face, now mine, calm and exact, and I felt the quiet satisfaction that comes when systems do what they're built to do: record, enforce, conclude. The page rested in the folder, and the balance finally stayed put. I returned to the building in the early morning when the city hasn't decided what it wants yet, and glass behaves like water held still. The lobby recognizes me without ceremony. Doors part on timing alone, and the quiet feels earned rather than granted. I ride the elevator up with no agenda beyond closure, the hum steady, my reflections singular in the brushed metal. The office is empty when I step inside, chairs aligned, screens asleep. The architecture reduced to its honest bones. I walk to the window that used to split me into roles and stand there without adjusting my posture, letting the light take its time. The city spreads below in pale layers, traffic beginning to stitch its patterns, and I feel the absence of urgency register as relief. The window glass is clean, a broad plane that reflects only what's present, and I watch my face settle into a version that doesn't need rehearsal. There are messages waiting always, but I don't reach for the phone yet. Aftermath deserves space. I think about how rooms teach behavior, how silence once demanded performance, and how performance dissolves when authority changes hands without raising its voice. The folder sits on a chair nearby, lighter now that its purpose has been fulfilled, and I leave it there, an artifact that no longer needs guarding. I open a cabinet to return keys. I don't need any more metal clinking softly, and the sound echoes longer than expected in the empty floor. The window holds my outline steady, no overlap, no argument. The glass finally showed one face, and it wasn't his. I breathe in and notice how air moves differently when it doesn't have to pass through permission first. The building feels the same, which is how you know the change is real. Systems don't flinch when ownership shifts cleanly. I cross the floor once more, letting memory loosen its grip on corners and thresholds, and stop at the window again, because endings benefit from repetition. Outside, the day commits light climbing the facades, reflections multiplying where they always have, indifferent to the story they once helped tell. I don't catalog the past anymore. Cataloging is a tool for uncertainty, and uncertainty has left the room. The empty window holds me whole, and the reflection answers to no one. I leave without looking back.